The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the spring of 1882, carried by a stage driver who smelled of tobacco and regret, and Florence Cooper nearly threw it into the fire without reading it. She had been standing at the stove when the knock came, her hands dusted with flour and her hair pulled back into a knot that did its job without doing it beautifully, and she supposed that was a fair description of Florence herself. She did her job. She kept the small homestead outside of Caldwell, Kansas, running with the kind of quiet, relentless efficiency that her father had praised before he died, and that the neighbors acknowledged without much warmth. She was 26 years old, and she was not the kind of woman men wrote letters to. So when old P.D. Marsh handed her the envelope and said it had come all the way from a post office down in Texas, she stood in her doorway with flour on her knuckles and looked at it like it might bite her. It did not bite her. It sat in her apron pocket for 2 hours while she finished her bread, and only when the loaves were in the oven and the kitchen was warm with that particular golden smell did she sit down at the table and open it. The handwriting was careful. Not elegant, but careful, the way a man writes when he is trying to say something true and does not want to get the words wrong. "Miss Florence Cooper," it began, "you do not know me. My name is Nelson Carver. I am 31 years of age and I work cattle on the Longbow Ranch outside of Amarillo, Texas. I have been working that land for 9 years and have recently purchased a portion of it from my employer, Mr. Denton, who is getting old and has no sons. I have a house. It is not large, but it is solid and it has a good well. I am writing to you because your name was given to me by Reverend Howell, who is known to your pastor, Reverend Adams. I am told you are capable, honest, and of good character. I do not know what you look like, and I will tell you plainly that I am not a handsome man myself, so neither of us need worry about that particular ledger. I would like to correspond with you if you are willing, and if the letters go well, I would like to come and meet you. I am not a man who beats around the bush, so I will say it directly. I am looking for a wife, and I am looking for one worth keeping, which means I am not looking for pretty. I am looking for real. If that seems foolish or forward to you, I understand and I will not trouble you again. But if it sounds like something worth considering, I hope you will write back. Yours respectfully, Nelson Carver." Florence read the letter twice. Then she folded it and put it in her apron pocket again and sat very still for a long moment while the wind pushed at the window glass. She had received exactly one other letter of matrimonial nature in her life, from a man in Wichita who had seen her at a church social, and written her a letter so full of flowery language and vague promises that she had felt vaguely insulted by the whole enterprise, as though he were writing to the idea of a woman rather than to her specifically. She had not written back. This letter was different. This letter was plain and honest and a little awkward, and it felt like it had been written by a person rather than a performance. She wrote back that evening by lamplight. She told him she kept a homestead of 60 acres with a small cattle operation, a vegetable garden, and 6 laying hens. She told him her father had died 3 years prior, and that she had been running the place alone since then with occasional help from a neighboring family named Prout. She told him she was 26. She told him she was not a woman of delicate sensibilities, and that she found excessive politeness exhausting. And then, because she was Florence Cooper and she did not believe in letting a man walk into anything unprepared, she told him that she was plain. She wrote it carefully. "I am not a woman who turns heads," she wrote. "I want you to know that before anything goes further, because I will not have a man feel he was misled. I am plain, and I say it not as a complaint but as a fact, the same as I would tell you the well is 40 feet deep or that the north fence needs mending. I thought you should know." She sealed the letter and walked it to the post office herself the next morning before she could think better of it. She did not expect a quick reply. The distances were considerable and the post was unreliable, and she told herself that if she did not hear back, that was a perfectly sensible outcome and she would not be wounded by it. She was Florence Cooper. She was not wounded by sensible outcomes. He wrote back in 11 days. "Miss Cooper," his letter said, I received your letter and I have read it several times because I wanted to make sure I understood everything you said. I appreciate plain speaking more than I can tell you. I want to address the thing you said about being plain. I do not think I understand what you mean by it, not because I think you are being dishonest, but because I suspect you are describing yourself the way a person describes a thing they have stopped looking at carefully. That is neither here nor there. What I will say is this: I am not riding 200 miles for pretty. Pretty is easy to find and hard to trust. You told me about your fence and your well and your hens and your 60 acres, and you told me you are not a woman given to delicate sensibilities, and I will be honest with you, Miss Cooper. That letter made me feel more hopeful than I have felt in a very long time. I would like to keep writing if you are agreeable. I would like to know what kind of cattle you run. I would like to know if you have trouble with the weather this time of year. And I would like to know, if it is not too personal a question, what you do when the day is done and the work is finished, because I think a person's quiet hours say more about them than their working ones. Yours, Nelson Carver. Florence sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about what he had said, about pretty being easy to find and hard to trust. And she thought about the fact that this man she had never seen had apparently dismissed her self-deprecation, not with empty flattery, but with something closer to curiosity. And she found that the knot in her chest that she had carried around for a long time without quite naming it had loosened slightly. She wrote back and told him she ran shorthorn cattle, 12 head currently, and that the spring weather in Kansas was mercurial at best and downright treacherous at worst, and that last March a hailstorm had taken out half her garden and bent the chicken coop roof so that she had spent 2 days in the mud straightening it. She told him that when the day was done she read. She had a small collection of books that had been her mother's, mostly practical things like an almanac and a book on medicinal plants, but also a copy of Jane Eyre that she had read so many times the spine had given up entirely, and the pages had to be held together with a strip of leather. She told him she did not think that was very exciting information. She told him she thought his letter had been the most genuine correspondence she had received from a stranger in her life, and that she meant that as a compliment of the highest order. They wrote through the rest of April and all of May. The letters grew longer, and the questions grew more specific, and the formality of the early correspondence fell away like bark from a winter tree. He told her about the Longbow Ranch, about the particular quality of light over the Texas Panhandle in the late afternoon, about a horse he had raised from a foal named Drummond, who was going gray around the muzzle, but still ran like something was chasing him. He told her about his family, a mother in Missouri who was alive and sharp-minded, a brother who had gone to Colorado and not come back, a father who had been difficult in ways he described with the careful brevity of a man who did not enjoy being dramatic about painful things. She told him about her own parents, about her mother who had died when Florence was 13 and left her a collection of books and a very thorough understanding of how to make do with very little. She told him about her father, who had been a good man in the way that men are good when they are not tested too severely, and who had loved her in the uncomplicated way that parents sometimes love children they don't entirely know how to talk to. By the middle of June, something had shifted. She knew it had shifted because she caught herself, one morning while she was checking on the cattle, thinking about a specific thing he had written, something about how he had watched a thunderstorm come in across the plain from 30 miles off, and felt like the smallest thing in the world and the most alive he'd ever been. And she had stopped walking and stood in the pasture with her hand on the top rail of the fence and thought, I understand exactly what he means. And then she thought, I wonder if he will describe it in the next letter. She was not a romantic woman. She had never been under any particular illusion that she was one. But she was discovering, the kind of woman who could become very interested in a specific person, once that person had shown her who they were with honesty and without performance. And Nelson Carver had been doing exactly that for 2 months through the United States Postal Service. And Florence Cooper found herself, to her own mild alarm, looking forward to his letters in a way that felt a good deal warmer than simple correspondence. In mid-June, she received a letter that made her sit down in the middle of reading it. He wrote, "Miss Cooper, I have been thinking about something you said in your last letter, about how you have been managing the homestead alone for 3 years and how you don't expect that to change. I want to ask you directly, because I don't know how else to ask it. Would you be willing to let me come to Caldwell? I know we've been writing for only a couple of months, and I know that is not very long. But I have been thinking, and I do not think another 3 months of letters will tell me anything I do not already feel fairly certain about. I am not trying to be presumptuous. If you say no, I will understand it and I will keep writing and I will wait as long as you think is right. But if you are willing, I would like to make the ride up to Kansas and meet you face to face, and I think the only honorable reason to do that is because I am hoping, very sincerely, that you might be willing to consider becoming my wife. I understand if that is too fast. I only ask because I am a man who works for what he wants, and I do not see the point of delaying things that seem clear. And you seem very clear to me, Miss Cooper. Yours, Nelson Carver." Florence put the letter on the table and looked out the window at the Kansas sky, which was doing its mid-June best, high white clouds and a heat that pressed down on everything like a warm hand. She thought about what it would mean to say yes. She thought about what it would mean to say no. She thought about her 60 acres and her 12 shorthorn cattle and her 6 laying hens and her collection of books and the north fence that always needed something. She thought about being 30 years old and then 35 and then 40 in this house alone, which was not a thing she feared the way some women might, because Florence Cooper was not someone who required company to function. But she also thought, and this was the thought that took her by surprise, that she had been genuinely happy reading his letters. Not just occupied, not just distracted, but genuinely, quietly happy in the way she had not been since before her father died, and perhaps not even then. She wrote back the same day. "Come to Caldwell," she wrote. "I will not make you any promises I am not certain I can keep, but I will tell you honestly that your letters have been the best thing to happen to me in a very long time, and I think you deserve a fair chance to make your case in person. I will expect you when I see you, as the road from Texas is not an exact science. Yours, Florence Cooper." She walked the letter to the post office herself. On the way back she stopped and stood on the main street of Caldwell for a moment, looking at the buildings and the people going about their business in the bright afternoon, and she thought, something is about to change. She did not know if that thought frightened her or not. She decided to treat it like weather. It was coming, so she had best be ready. Nelson Carver received that letter on a morning when the Texas heat was already pressing hard against the land before 8 o'clock, and he read it 3 times standing by the fence post outside the bunkhouse, with Drummond watching him from the pasture, with the patient expression of a horse who has seen everything. He told his employer, the old man Denton, that he would be gone for 3 weeks minimum, possibly more. Denton, who was 74 and had the weathered good humor of a man who had lived long enough to find most things entertaining rather than alarming, looked at him and said, "This about that Kansas woman." Nelson said it was. Denton said, "Well, go on then. The herd will still be here." And then, after a pause, "Don't come back without her." Nelson packed his saddlebags with the economy of a man who had spent his adult life knowing exactly what he needed and what he didn't. He took enough for the weather. He took his good shirt. He took a small amount of money he had been setting aside for the past year, with a general notion toward the future that had now become considerably more specific. He saddled Drummond, and he set off north from Amarillo on a morning in late June of 1882, with the sky above him so blue it looked like it had been painted that way by someone who didn't fully understand restraint. 200 miles is a serious distance on horseback. He rode it over 7 days, camping most nights, taking one night in a small town called Pratt where there was a rooming house with a questionable mattress and a very good bowl of beef stew. He thought about Florence Cooper for most of those 7 days. He thought about the way she wrote, direct and dry and occasionally funny in a way that didn't seem to know it was funny, which he found somehow more delightful than intentional wit. He thought about the fact that she had told him she was plain like she was issuing a warning, and he had found that so honest and so unself-conscious that it had made him more interested in her, not less, because a woman who could assess herself without vanity and without false modesty and simply state a fact was a woman who was going to tell you the truth about other things too, and Nelson Carver placed enormous value on the truth. He arrived in Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in the first week of July. The town was busy with summer commerce, wagons and horses along the main street, the sound of the cattle trade that had made Caldwell one of the busiest cow towns in Kansas, the air carrying the particular mixture of dust and livestock and commerce that belonged to these places. He asked at the general store for directions to the Cooper homestead and was told it was about 3 miles south of town, that he would know it by the red paint on the barn door, which was faded to more of a rust color now but still distinct enough. He rode south and found it. It was a solid homestead, not large as he had expected, but well kept in a way that told him things about the person who kept it. The fences were mended, the garden was organized, the barn with its rust-red door was tidy. There was a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that showed clear evidence of attention, and the house itself, a single-story frame structure, had its windows clean and its porch swept. He sat on Drummond for a moment and looked at it. Then he got down. He was tying Drummond to the porch rail when the door opened. Florence Cooper came out onto her porch on that July afternoon and looked at him, and Nelson Carver looked back at her, and there was a moment of silence in which the Kansas wind moved through the tall grass around the homestead and a meadowlark called from somewhere behind the barn. She was exactly what she had told him she was, not the kind of woman who stopped a man in the street and made him forget his own name. Her hair was brown, pulled back practically. Her eyes were dark and steady, and direct in a way that reminded him of something a compass does, pointing true regardless of what you might want to point away from. She was wearing a work dress of blue cotton and she had her hands folded in front of her, and she was looking at him with an expression that was assessing and careful and not entirely without nerves, though she was clearly trying not to show the nerves. She said, "Mr. Carver," he said. "Miss Cooper," she said, "you look like your letters." He was not sure what that meant, but he thought it was probably a good thing. He said, "How is that?" she said, "straightforward. No excess." He looked at her. He said, "I told you I wasn't a handsome man," she said. "You told me a lot of things," he said. "They were all true." A beat passed. The meadowlark called again. She said, "I made supper. It will keep if you want to see to your horse first." He said that he did, and she pointed him toward the barn, and he took Drummond around and spent 20 minutes with him, seeing to the water and the feed, which gave him time to settle the particular quality of feeling that had come over him when she walked out onto that porch. He had not expected it to be so immediate. He had thought they would have to feel their way toward each other carefully, the way you do when you have only letters to go on. But when she had looked at him with those compass-point eyes and said he looked like his letters, he had felt something shift in him with a certainty that was almost uncomfortable in its definiteness. He went back to the house and washed his hands at the pump and came inside, and Florence Cooper served him supper at a table set for two, and they sat across from each other in her kitchen in the last of the July light and ate roasted chicken and boiled potatoes and cornbread, and it was very good food, and they talked. They talked the way people talk when they have been corresponding at length and finally sit down together, with the particular pleasure of confirmation. The voice matching the pen, the face matching the words. She was drier in person than even her letters suggested, with a very slight pause before the occasionally funny thing she said, which he realized was not because she was testing whether it was funny but because she was deciding whether to say it at all. He liked that. He laughed when she said the things that were funny, and she looked at him with something in her expression that he thought might be surprise, as though she had not quite expected him to catch them. He said, "I want to tell you something," she said. "Go ahead." he said. You told me in your letter that you were plain, and you said it like a warning. She said, It was a warning, he said. I know it was. I want you to know that I have not ridden 200 miles for pretty, Miss Cooper. I have ridden 200 miles because your letters told me more about who you are than most people manage to tell in years of acquaintance, and because whoever you are is someone I would very much like to know better, so I hope you will take your warning back. Florence Cooper looked at him across the table. She looked at him for a long moment in which the lamplight made everything gold and quiet. She said, I won't take it back, it's still a true fact, he said. I know it's a true fact. I'm asking you to stop issuing it like it ought to change something. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, You are very direct, he said. I told you that in the first letter, she said. You did. She looked down at her plate and then back up at him. All right, consider the warning withdrawn. He nodded. He said, Thank you. They ate the rest of the meal in a comfortable silence that was itself a kind of conversation. And afterward she made coffee and they sat on the porch in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the Kansas plains, the insects, and the distant low of cattle and the wind in the grass. And he told her about the last 7 days of riding, and she told him about the hailstorm that had come through 2 weeks ago and damaged the roof on the chicken coop again. And he asked her if she had the lumber to fix it, and she said she had the lumber. She just hadn't found the right moment, and he said he would look at it tomorrow if she was willing, and she said, You don't have to do that. He said, I know I don't have to, she said. All right then. He stayed at the Pruitt place, the neighboring family she had mentioned in her letters, who had a spare room and who were good-natured people of the no-nonsense Kansas variety. Mrs. Pruitt, a stout woman of formidable practicality and warm eyes, took one look at him that first evening and said, So you're the Texas man. He said he was. She said, Florence is a good woman. He said he was beginning to be very aware of that. Mrs. Pruitt nodded as if he had passed some kind of examination and told him breakfast was at 6. He spent the next 5 days at Florence Cooper's homestead. He fixed the chicken coop roof, which turned out to need more attention than a simple repair, and kept him busy most of the first full day. He helped her move a section of the north fence, the one that always needed something, because 2 of the posts had rotted at the base and were barely standing. He worked alongside her, and she worked with the efficiency and physical competence of someone who had been doing this alone for 3 years. And he watched her work and thought about how different that was from the idea of a woman he might have carried in some corner of his mind without examining it very closely, and how much better the reality was. She watched him too. She was not obvious about it, but she was thorough, because Florence Cooper approached everything thoroughly. She watched the way he worked, carefully and without wasted motion, and the way he was with Drummond, who was clearly adored. She watched the way he talked to Mr. Pruitt when that man came over to introduce himself properly, plain and respectful and interested in what the older man had to say. She watched the way he looked at her land, not with the assessing eye of someone calculating its worth, but with a specific, focused attention that seemed to be about understanding it for its own sake. On the 4th day, he asked if she wanted to ride out to the edge of her property to look at the fence line. She saddled her mare, a steady roan named Clara, and they rode out together through the tall summer grass under a sky that had gone from blue to the particular pale gold of a Kansas afternoon. They rode without talking for a while, which was comfortable rather than awkward, and then he said, I want to ask you something, she said. Ask it, he said. Do you think you could be happy in Texas? She considered the question the way she considered things, directly and without evasion. She said, I don't know Texas, he said. You would, in time, she said. What would I be going to? He said, the piece of the longbow I bought, about 400 acres. A house that needs some work on the porch but is otherwise sound. Good well, good land. The cattle operation I've been building for 9 years. He paused. Me. She looked out at the prairie. She said, What would happen to this place? He said. That's for you to decide. You could sell it or you could let it. The Pruitts might want to expand their operation, or you could keep it and we could come up some summers, she said. You've thought about this? He said, I've been thinking about it since February, when Reverend Howell first told me there was a woman in Kansas I ought to write to. She looked at him. She said, "That's a long time to think about a stranger," he said. "You stopped being a stranger somewhere around the third letter." She turned back to the horizon. The roan shifted beneath her and Clara's ears moved with the sound of a distant bird. Florence said, "I am not an easy woman to know." He said, "I know that," she said. "I am set in my ways and I am not given to sentiment and I have opinions about things and I don't keep quiet about them." He said, "I know that too." She said, "And you still rode 200 miles, he said, "and I'd ride it again." A silence. The grass moved in long, rippling waves like water. She said quietly, "I don't know what to do with you, Mr. Carver." He said, "That is the most encouraging thing you've said to me so far." She looked at him, and for the first time since he had arrived, he saw something happen in her face that was not the careful composure she maintained like a good fence. Something underneath it that was uncertain and almost young, and he thought, "There she is." He thought it with a feeling that was very warm and very sure. She said, "Give me until the end of your visit," he said. "Take all the time you need." On the fifth day, a complication arrived in the form of a man named Gerald Hatch. Gerald Hatch was 38 years old and had a spread of land to the east of Caldwell that was considerably larger than Florence's, and about which he had very clear opinions. He had been angling toward Florence Cooper's homestead for the better part of 2 years, not out of any particular feeling for Florence herself, but because her 60 acres would conveniently connect 2 portions of his own land. He had made this interest known to her on several occasions in a manner that could be charitably described as businesslike and less charitably described as presumptuous, and Florence had told him on each occasion that her land was not for sale, and he had listened to this the way men like Gerald Hatch listened to women, which is to say that he heard the words but did not particularly believe them, because he had found that persistence generally worked where negotiation hadn't. He rode up to the Cooper homestead on that 5th day and found Nelson Carver on the porch replacing a section of the porch railing that had gone soft, and he stopped his horse and looked at the stranger with the particular combination of surprise and displeasure that men like Gerald Hatch display when they find something where they did not expect it. He said, "Who are you?" Nelson said. "Nelson Carver." "And yourself?" Hatch said. "Gerald Hatch. I have land east of here. I'm a neighbor." He said it in the way that implies a claim. "Is Miss Cooper about?" Florence came to the door at that moment with a dish towel in her hands and looked at Hatch with an expression that Nelson would later describe to Mr. Prout as the look of a woman who has found a beetle in her flour barrel. She said, "Mr. Hatch." Hatch said, "Miss Cooper, I see you have company." He looked at Nelson again. "From where?" Florence said. "Texas." Hatch said, "Long way to come for a social call." Nelson said pleasantly, "It's not precisely a social call." Hatch looked at Florence. Florence looked back at him with her compass-steady eyes and said, "Mr. Carver and I have been corresponding since February. He has come to call." She said it with the flat simplicity of a woman who is not asking for anyone's opinion. Hatch's expression did a complicated series of things. Then he said, "I see. Well, I came to talk to you about the matter of the east fence line, Miss Cooper, as I believe part of it may be on my property." Florence said, "That fence line has not moved in 11 years, Mr. Hatch, and my father had it surveyed in 1874. If you have concerns, you may take them to the county office." She said it without heat, just clear. Then she said, "Was there anything else?" Hatch looked at Nelson once more. Nelson was watching the horizon with an expression of polite indifference that Hatch seemed to find more irritating than hostility would have been. Hatch said, "I'll be in touch," and rode off. Florence watched him go. Then she came out onto the porch and looked at the half-repaired railing and then at Nelson and said, "He has been trying to get this land for 2 years." Nelson said, "I noticed." She said, "He is the kind of man who thinks a woman managing alone means a woman who can be managed." He said, "How has that been going for him?" She said, "About as well as everything else he's tried." He looked at her. There was something in the set of her jaw that he found very compelling, the way she was not angry so much as certain, like a woman who has fought this particular battle enough times that it has become almost boring. He said, "You won't have to do it alone much longer if you say yes." She looked at him. She said, "Is that a proposal, Mr. Carver?" He said, "It is the part just before the proposal. I didn't want to do it half finished." She said, "When will it be finished?" He said, "When I've fixed this railing." She looked at the railing. She said, "It'll be done in an hour." He said, "Then you have an hour." She went back inside. He finished the railing in just under an hour and went to find her in the kitchen, where she was doing something to a pot on the stove that required her complete attention. He stood in the doorway. She did not turn around. He said, "Miss Cooper." She said, "Mr. Carver." He said, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She set down her spoon and turned around. She looked at him for a moment with those steady, dark eyes. He was standing in her kitchen doorway with sawdust on his shirt and his hat in his hands, and he was not a handsome man. He had told her that himself, and it was true in the conventional sense. His face was angular and weathered, and his nose had been broken at some point and not set quite straight. But he was looking at her with an expression of such complete and earnest seriousness that Florence Cooper felt something in the vicinity of her chest do something she could not immediately name. She said, "Before I answer that, I want to say something." He said, "Go ahead." She said, "I told you in my letter that I was plain, and I said it like a warning. You wrote back that you had not ridden 200 miles for pretty." She paused. "I want you to know that I have been thinking about that since you arrived. I have been thinking that I did not know what to do with it, because nobody has ever said anything like that to me before. Most men either try to tell me I'm not plain, which I know to be false, or they agree with me and move on. You did neither. You said the plain part wasn't the point, and I have spent 5 days trying to find the catch in that." He said, "Did you find one?" She said, "No." He said, "Good." She said, "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "Yes, Mr. Carver, I will marry you." He let out a breath that he had apparently been holding for some time. He said, "Thank you, Miss Cooper." She said, "Florence." He said, "Florence." And the way he said it, like it meant something, like he had been waiting to say it like that, made her turn back to the stove, because she was not a woman who let herself be undone easily, and she felt that she was currently in danger of being undone. They told the Pruitts that evening. Mrs. Pruitt made a sound that was very nearly a squeal, which was undignified for a woman of her years and composure, and which she immediately tried to disguise as a cough. Mr. Pruitt shook Nelson's hand and told him that Florence Cooper was worth 10 of most women, and that he'd better know what he was getting, and Nelson said, "I have been learning since February, sir." And Mr. Pruitt looked satisfied by that. Florence wrote to Reverend Adams the next morning and asked him to post the banns. Nelson sent a letter south to Amarillo and to his employer Denton, and wrote briefly to his mother in Missouri that he hoped would reach her in time for her to come north, though the distances involved made that uncertain. The wedding was set for 3 weeks hence, to allow for the posting of banns and for Nelson to make arrangements. He rode back to Caldwell's Main Street and visited the small jeweler there, a German man named Hoffman who had come west in the 1860s and whose shop was surprisingly well stocked for a cow town. Nelson bought a simple gold ring, not expensive but not cheap, and Hoffman told him the sizing could be adjusted and asked him to describe the lady's hands. Nelson said, "Strong. She works with them." Hoffman said, "Then she will not want something delicate." Nelson said he agreed completely. In those 3 weeks before the wedding, something happened that surprised Florence. She found that she was not afraid. She had expected to be. She had spent so many years building her self-sufficiency into a kind of fortress that she had assumed any breach of it would feel like a threat. But Nelson Carver did not feel like a threat. He felt like something she had not had a word for, someone who looked at her life with genuine respect and no condescension, who helped when helping was needed and stepped back when it wasn't, who listened when she talked and said what he meant when he did. He was back in Texas for those 3 weeks, arranging the transfer of his horses and equipment and the management of the longbow portion during his extended absence, and they went back to letters for that brief time, and the letters were different now, warmer and more frank, signed Nelson rather than Nelson Carver, signed Florence rather than Florence Cooper. Nelson's mother, Estelle Carver, a woman of 62 who had spent her life in Missouri and was not in the best of health, could not make the journey to Kansas, but she sent a letter to Florence that arrived 4 days before the wedding. It was a short letter, not effusive, which Florence found appropriate. It said, "I have known my son for 31 years and I know the quality of him. He does not do things lightly and he does not love lightly. If he has ridden 200 miles for you, then you are worth it. I hope we will meet someday. Your new mother-in-law, Estelle Carver." Florence read that letter at the kitchen table and felt the knot in her chest loosen another degree, and did not fully understand why until she realized that it was the word mother-in-law that had done it. The simple fact of it, the fact that she was about to have family again. Nelson returned to Caldwell 4 days before the wedding with Drummond and a second horse, a bay gelding named Porter, and a wagon containing more of his belongings than he had brought on the first trip. The wedding was on a Saturday in late July at the small church in Caldwell, where Reverend Adams presided with the sober cheerfulness of a man who performed this ceremony regularly and had not yet tired of it. Florence wore a dress of pale gray, which was the best dress she owned, and she wore her hair down for what felt like the first time in memory, and Mrs. Prout had done something to it with a comb that made it look softer. Florence stood in front of the mirror in Mrs. Prout's bedroom before the ceremony and looked at herself the way she had been looking at herself her whole life, frankly and without expectation, and she thought, "Well, you are still what you are." But there was something different in her face that she could not quite name. Later she would decide it was the look of a woman who had been seen. The church was not full, but it was filled with the people who mattered. The Prouts in their good clothes, several neighbors and townspeople who had known Florence for years, the owner of the general store who had known her father, Reverend Adams's wife who always cried at weddings regardless of the circumstances. Nelson was already at the altar when Florence came in, and he turned when she walked through the door, and the way he looked at her made Reverend Adams's wife cry earlier than usual. He had told her he was not a handsome man, and that was still true, but he was wearing a dark coat and his boots were clean, and he was looking at her as though everything he had ridden 200 miles for was walking through that door, which was exactly what was happening. They said the words that people have said in churches in the American West and elsewhere, the binding words, the serious and ancient words, and when Reverend Adams said, "You may kiss your bride," Nelson Carver put his hands on either side of Florence Cooper's face very carefully, as though she were something worth being careful with, and kissed her once, gently, and Florence, who was not a woman given to public sentiment, felt her eyes sting and pressed them closed and breathed through it. Mrs. Prout did squeal this time and made no attempt to disguise it. They had 2 more weeks in Kansas before they would head south to Texas. They used them well. Florence made decisions about the homestead. After several conversations with the Prouts, she arranged for their eldest son, Thomas, who was 22 and looking to start an operation of his own, to lease the 60 acres and the house. The terms were fair and documented properly with the county office. She sold 8 of her 12 shorthorn cattle and arranged for Thomas to take on the remaining 4 as part of the lease agreement, which would give him a start. She sold the laying hens to a woman in town who kept a large flock. She went through the house methodically and decided what to take and what to leave, and the deciding was less painful than she had expected because Nelson had sat with her through the process and not tried to rush her or tell her what was important, only helped when she asked him to. She packed her mother's books. She packed the almanac and the medicinal plant reference and the copy of Jane Eyre with the leather-bound spine. She packed her father's pocket watch, which had stopped working years ago but kept because it had been his. She packed her tools, the ones she would need, because she was a practical woman and she knew she would need them. She packed 2 dresses and her work clothes and her winter coat. She stood in the house the morning they were to leave and went through it one last time alone. The kitchen with the good stove, the small parlor with the window that faced west, the bedroom where she had slept for 26 years, first as a child and then as a girl and then as a woman on her own. She touched the doorframe on the way out the way you touch things you are letting go of, carefully once, with acknowledgement. Then she walked out to where Nelson was hitching the wagon and said, "All right, let's go." He looked at her. He said, "All right," she said. "Yes," he said, "we can come back." "I meant what I said about Summers," she said. "I know you meant it." She climbed up onto the wagon seat. "Come on, then." He climbed up beside her. The morning was clear and warm with a light wind from the south, as if the Texas direction itself were welcoming them, and they drove out of the yard with the Prout family standing at the fence to wave them off. Mrs. Prout in tears, Mr. Prout with his hat in his hand, Thomas already walking toward the house with the practical readiness of a young man who has a lot of work ahead of him. Florence watched the homestead get smaller in the distance behind them. She did not look away until she could no longer see the rust-red barn door. Then she faced forward. Nelson's hand found hers on the wagon seat and she let it stay there, which for Florence Cooper was a considerable gesture of sentiment, and he seemed to understand that because he did not make anything of it. He just kept it there, warm and steady, and they drove south toward the summer horizon. The journey from Caldwell to Amarillo took 10 days by wagon, with a horse tied at the back and the summer heat building as they moved south. They camped most nights under a sky that grew bigger and more open the further south they went, and they talked through the long riding hours in a way that felt like a deepening of everything the letters had started. They talked about their childhoods and their parents and the things they believed and the things they were uncertain about. Florence told him, on the third night camped by a small creek with the fire going down to embers, about the year after her mother died when she was 13, and she had been so angry about it that she had not known what to do with the anger and had finally put it into work. Into learning everything there was to learn about keeping a house and a kitchen and eventually a farm, because industry had been the only thing that quieted the anger. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "That is the most I have heard you say at one time." She said, "Don't get used to it," he said. "I'll get used to it slowly." She smiled, which was still a thing she didn't do casually, and which he noticed every time with the particular attention of a man cataloging something precious. He told her about his brother, the one who had gone to Colorado and not come back. He said his name was James, and that they had not been close as boys, being too different in temperament, and that James had gone west in 1874 and sent letters for 2 years and then stopped, and that Nelson had spent a year trying to find out what had happened and had eventually been told by a man passing through Amarillo who had known James in Colorado that James had died in a mining accident in 1877. He said, "I don't know if not being close makes it easier or harder. I think it just makes it different." Florence said, "Different," he said. "Yes," she said, "I think you are right." By the time they crossed into the Texas Panhandle, Florence had begun to feel the particular quality of the land that Nelson had described in his letters, the bigness of it, the way the sky here seemed wider than it did in Kansas, which had not seemed a small sky. The colors were different, the grasses browner, the rock outcroppings red-orange, the light at the end of the day extraordinary in a way that she thought she might spend years looking at and not fully explaining. She said to Nelson on that first evening in Texas proper, "You said the light here was something," he said. "Does it match?" She looked west at the sunset, which was doing things with orange and purple that seemed excessive. She said, "It exceeds," he said. "I think so too. I never got tired of it." They arrived at the Longbow on a Thursday in August. Old Denton was on his porch when they drove up, a man of 74 with white hair and the permanent squint of a man who has spent his life looking at horizons. He climbed down off the porch with some effort and came to meet them and shook Nelson's hand and then turned to Florence and took her hand in both of his, which were very large and very dry, and said, "I am very glad to meet you, Mrs. Carver." It was the first time anyone had called her that. She said, "Mr. Denton, I have heard a great deal about you," he said, All of it good, I hope, she said. Most of it. He laughed, which turned into a cough, and then he said to Nelson, I knew I'd like her. The house was as Nelson had described, not large but solid. The porch that needed work was on the west side, 2 boards soft and 1 support beam showing rot. The inside was clean because Nelson had asked a woman from the nearest small settlement to come through before their arrival, and it smelled of soap and of the good Texas air coming through the windows. It was not the house Florence had grown up in, and it was not the house she had kept alone for 3 years. It was a different house. She walked through it with the thoroughness she brought to all assessments, looking at the stove, looking at the state of the chimney flue, looking at the pantry, which was stocked with basics, looking at the bedroom, which had a bed considerably larger than her old one. She came back to the main room where Nelson was standing waiting for her assessment the way a man waits for a verdict. She said, The porch needs to be done before winter. He said, I know. She said, The pantry organization wants attention. He said, That's yours to do as you see fit. She said, The kitchen stove is better than mine was. He said, I thought you'd like that. She said, The bedroom window faces east, good for the morning light. He said, I know. She said, All right. She looked around the room once more. She said, I think we can make something good of this. He said, I know we can. She looked at him. She said, and this was the most she would say on this particular subject at this particular moment, which was more than she had expected of herself, I think I am going to like it here. He crossed the room in 3 steps and took her face in his hands the way he had at the wedding, as though she were worth being careful with, and kissed her, not gently this time, but with the feeling of everything that had been building since February in letters and over 200 miles and 10 days in a wagon, and Florence, who was not a woman who was undone easily, was thoroughly undone. She put her hands against his chest and did not push him away. The months that followed were the months of building something. They fixed the porch before September was out. Florence reorganized the pantry and the kitchen with an efficiency that made Nelson stand in the doorway one afternoon and say, Everything is in the right place now, isn't it? She said it was. He said, It wasn't before. She said, No, it wasn't. He said, How is it that you know where things belong? She said, It's not complicated. You put things where you can reach them when you need them. He said, That's a philosophy. She said, I suppose it is. She learned the land. She was methodical about it, the way she was methodical about everything, asking questions that were specific and detailed, and processing the answers completely before asking the next one. She went out with Nelson in the mornings to understand the cattle operation, which was larger than her own had been, a herd of 43 at that point, and she brought to it the same quiet competence she had brought to her Kansas homestead, and the ranch hands who worked on the longbow, 2 regular men named Cal and Roy who had been with Nelson for years, quickly revised whatever assumptions they had arrived with about the new Mrs. Carver. Cal, a lean man of 40 with a remarkable mustache, said to Roy one afternoon while they were mending the south fence, speaking in what they thought was a voice too low to carry, She's something, isn't she? Roy said, She knows more about shorthorn cattle than I do. Cal said, I know it. Roy said, That's not nothing. Cal said, It's not nothing at all. Florence, who had excellent hearing and had been within earshot, said nothing. But she told Nelson about it that evening, and he laughed in the way he laughed when something pleased him thoroughly, and she found she had an absolute appreciation for that laugh, the specific sound of it. October came to the Texas Panhandle with a sharpness that surprised her. Not cold like a Kansas October, which she knew well, but different, drier, with a wind that came off the plain with a particular determination. She put up the preserves she had made from the garden she had started in August, somewhat late in the season but productive enough. She studied the medicinal plant book against the local flora, which was different enough from Kansas to require recalibration. She rode Clara out over the land and learned its topography with the same care she gave everything. In the evenings she and Nelson sat at the table or on the mended porch and talked, or he worked on accounts and she read. She was working through her mother's books again, starting with the almanac for the relevant information and then the medicinal plants and then Jane Eyre, and one evening he looked up from his ledger and said, "You've read that before," she said. "Many times," he said. "Why that one specifically?" She considered. She said, "Because Jane Eyre knows what she is worth and she doesn't apologize for it even when she has very little." He said, "That is a good reason." She said, "What are you reading?" He said, "Cattle Ledger." She said, "I could help with that." He looked at her. He said, "Do you want to?" She said, "I managed my own accounts for 3 years and I grew up watching my father do his, and I think I am probably better at it than I am at letting you do it without oversight." He slid the ledger across the table. She looked through it for 20 minutes in silence. Then she said, "You're overcharging yourself for the feed calculation. You're using the summer rate on the winter estimate." He looked where she was pointing. He said, "I'll be." She said, "It comes out to about $17 over the course of a year." He said, "That's not nothing." She said, "It's not nothing at all." After that, they did the accounts together. November brought 2 significant events. The first was a letter from Thomas Prout in Kansas saying that he had settled well into the homestead, that the 4 shorthorn cattle were doing well, and that the north fence section had held through the first cold spell. Florence read this with a feeling she did not examine too closely, but which felt something like relief, the relief of knowing that the place she had made was being cared for. The second event was the discovery that Florence was expecting. She made this discovery on a Tuesday morning in mid-November with the same practicality she brought to all discoveries, assessed the physical evidence thoroughly, consulted her medical plant book for any relevant information, and then told Nelson that evening over supper. He put down his fork. He looked at her. He said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I do not make announcements I am not sure about." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and his voice was different in a way that made her look at him more closely, "Florence," she said. "What?" he said. "I didn't want to tell you this because I didn't want it to influence anything, but I have been hoping for this since before we were married." She said, "You might have mentioned it," he said. "I didn't want to put pressure on something that couldn't be hurried," she said. "That is an unusually wise position for a man," he said. "I have my moments." She said, "I know you do." He got up from his chair and came around the table and took her hand and held it, and she let him, and the fire in the stove crackled, and the Texas wind pushed at the windows, and everything was quiet and warm and full of something she had not had enough of in her life but was beginning, slowly, to learn to trust. Old Denton, when told the news, said, "Now that's the best thing I've heard since I sold that piece of land to a man worth selling it to." He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand in a manner he clearly hoped would go unremarked. Florence remarked it silently and was touched by it. The winter was not severe, by Texas Panhandle standards, which meant it was cold enough to require serious attention and not cold enough to be dangerous. Florence kept the house and helped manage the ranch and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she was not maintaining things but building them. There is a difference that she had not known she was missing. Maintenance is holding the line, but building is going forward, and Florence Cooper had been holding lines for so long that the sensation of going forward was almost disorienting in its goodness. She wrote long letters to Mrs. Prout, who wrote back with equal length and considerable warmth, and who had clearly decided that Florence was a daughter in spirit if not in fact. She wrote to Estelle Carver in Missouri, Nelson's mother, and those letters were shorter and more careful, the cautious beginning of a relationship conducted entirely through paper, but they were genuine on both sides, and Estelle wrote back with a directness that Florence recognized as familial. Nelson's mother wrote in one letter, "Your husband tells me you are making the ranch something better than it was. He says you see things he missed. I believe it. He was always a man who worked hard and looked straight ahead and sometimes needed someone to point sideways. That is not a criticism. It is one of the best things about him. He knows it." Florence read that letter twice and then read it to Nelson and watched his face do something private and complicated that she thought was the face of a man who misses his mother, and she thought, We will go to Missouri when the baby is old enough. She filed that thought for later and told him it was a good letter, and he said, "She likes you," and Florence said, "I like her." The spring arrived in March with the particular determination of a Texas spring, which is to say that it arrived suddenly, and at full intensity, the grasses going green almost overnight, the sky performing daily spectacles that Florence had not entirely come to expect even after half a year. The ranch was busy with calving season, and she was busy with the calving in the way she was busy with all things that required attention, thoroughly and capably, and the ranch hands Cal and Roy had by this point abandoned whatever initial reserve they had maintained toward her and simply included her in the work as a matter of course. Cal said to Nelson one morning, "Your wife told me the Henderson heifer was going to have trouble, and she was right." Nelson said, "I know she was right. What did you think?" Cal said, "I thought it was going to be fine." A pause. "It wasn't," Nelson said. Cal said, "How does she know things like that?" Nelson said, "She pays attention." Cal looked at this for a moment and said, "Well, yes." He went back to work. Florence was 7 months along when Gerald Hatch made his appearance in Texas. This was unexpected. She had not thought of him in months, and when a rider came to the ranch with a card that read Gerald P. Hatch, Caldwell, Kansas, she stood on the porch and looked at it with the expression of a woman who has found a beetle in her flour barrel a second time. He arrived the following afternoon on a good horse, and looking prosperous in the way that men like Gerald Hatch always look prosperous, slightly too well fitted for the country they're in. He tipped his hat at Florence on the porch and then at Nelson, who had come out of the barn, and he said, "Mrs. Carver, I didn't know you were expecting. Congratulations." Florence said, "Mr. Hatch, this is a long way for a visit." Hatch said, "I'm in the region on business. Cattle I've been buying south." He looked at Nelson. "Carver, Florence has spoken of you." Nelson said, "I know who you are." Hatch said, "I wanted to come by and put something to you both now that things are settled." He looked at Florence. "Thomas Pruitt is finding the lease arrangement difficult. He may not be able to keep it up." Florence said, "I have a letter from Thomas dated March that says nothing of the kind." Hatch said, "Things change. I am in a position to take the land off your hands at a fair price, Mrs. Carver. It would simplify matters for you." Florence looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "My land in Kansas is not for sale, Mr. Hatch. That has not changed since you first asked me 2 years ago, and I don't expect it will change. If Thomas is struggling, I will correspond with him directly. Is there anything else?" Hatch looked at Nelson. Nelson said, "You heard my wife." There was a pause. Hatch said, "You're a stubborn woman, Florence." Nelson said, "That's Mrs. Carver to you, and what you're calling stubborn is what I'd call clear-headed." Hatch looked at him for a moment and then, with the particular dignity of a man who has run out of moves but will not admit it, tipped his hat and said he'd be on his way. They watched him ride off the property. Nelson said after a moment, "Do you think Pruitt is actually struggling?" Florence said, "No, I think Hatch wants my land and he made that up, or at best exaggerated something small." She said it without particular emotion. Then she said, "I'll write to Thomas this week." She wrote to Thomas that week. Thomas wrote back and said he was doing fine, the lease was going well, the shorthorn cattle were fat and happy, and he had no idea why anyone would have said otherwise. Florence wrote to Hatch's information on file with the county office and told him in formal and exact terms that the Cooper property was not available and that further approaches on the matter would be directed to the county recorder to be noted. Then she filed the whole thing and moved on, because Florence Cooper did not spend more energy on a problem than the problem warranted. The baby came in late May of 1883. Nelson was in the house for all of it, which was not traditional, and about which Cal and Roy had opinions they did not express out loud, and Dr. Reeves from the nearest town arrived in time to be useful, and the process was long and serious, and at one point in the small hours of the morning, Nelson was gripping Florence's hand in both of his, and she was looking at him with those compass eyes, and saying with some force that she was perfectly fine and he should stop making a face like a man watching a disaster unfold. He said, "I'm not making any particular face," she said. "You are making the face of a man who cannot help anything and knows it." He said, "That is accurate," she said. "Then stop worrying and talk to me." He said, "About what?" she said. "About anything, about the light on the plane, about Drummond, about anything." So he talked, in a quiet voice, about the morning 2 years ago when he had been out riding the ranch boundary and a storm had come in from the northwest, and he had stopped and watched it from 30 miles off, and how it had felt like being the smallest thing in the world and the most alive, and Florence lay in the lamplight with her jaw set, and her eyes fixed on his face and listened, and at 6 o'clock in the morning their son was born. He was a healthy boy with lungs that announced themselves with authority, and a face that was, in the manner of new babies, not yet quite itself, but already suggesting someone specific. He had Florence's dark eyes, the compass kind, and a considerable amount of hair for a newborn. Nelson held him for the first time with the careful intensity of a man holding something he cannot believe is real. He looked at Florence over the baby's head and said, "Are you all right?" she said. "I am better than all right." He said, "You told me you were fine when you were very not fine." She said, "I did not want you to panic." He said, "I panicked anyway." She said, "I know." "You were reasonably quiet about it." He looked down at the baby. He said, "What do we call him?" She had been thinking about it. She said, "William, after my father." He said, "William Carver." He said it twice, trying the weight of it. He said, "That's a good name." She said, "I think so." He said, "William James Carver, if it's agreeable to you. James after my brother." She said, "William James Carver, yes, that's right." He sat on the edge of the bed with William James Carver in his arms and Florence's hand in his, and the morning light came through the east-facing bedroom window exactly as he had known it would, and everything was very bright and very full. They wrote to everyone. Mrs. Prout sent a letter back that was largely exclamation and warmth. Estelle Carver in Missouri sent a letter of 2 pages that was more restrained but which ended, "I cannot tell you what it means to me. I am hoping very much to come south to meet him before too much time has passed." Florence wrote back immediately, "You must come. We will make the arrangements." Estelle Carver came to Texas in the September of 1883, traveling by train to as far as the rail went, and then by hired coach the rest of the way. A journey that took her 4 days and cost her considerably in physical effort, because she was not well and had not been well for some time, though she had not made much of this in her letters. She was a small woman, bird-boned, with white hair and the same angular face as her son and the same quality of looking at things directly, and when Florence met her at the door of the ranch house she took Florence's hands and held them and looked at her for a moment and said, "Yes, I see why." Florence said, "I see it too. He has your eyes." Estelle said, "He has your eyes, the boy." Florence said, "They are similar eyes." Estelle said, "They are the kind that see clearly." She said it with satisfaction. Then she said, "May I hold him?" And Florence brought William James out and put him in his grandmother's arms, and Estelle Carver stood in the main room of the Texas ranch house and held her grandson with an expression that Florence looked at only briefly, because it seemed too private for extended observation. Estelle stayed 3 weeks. She and Florence developed in those 3 weeks a friendship that neither of them would have predicted in advance, and that both of them recognized as genuine in the way that real things are recognizable. They were similar women in important ways: direct, unsentimental in expression but not in feeling, inclined to practicality as a first response and emotion as a close second. They sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about the things that women who are past performance talk about, and Nelson sometimes came out and sat with them and mostly listened, and occasionally said something that made both women look at him with expressions of mild amusement. On the night before Estelle was to leave, she and Florence sat on the porch after Nelson had gone in and the moon was up over the plain, and Estelle said, "I want to say something to you, Florence." Florence said, "Go ahead." Estelle said, "When Nelson wrote to me in February last year that he was going to write to a woman in Kansas, I was glad but I was worried too, because he is not an easy man to know and he is slow to show what he feels, and I worried that the right woman might not see it, might think there was less there than there was." She paused. "I do not think you had that difficulty," Florence said. "No, I think I saw it fairly quickly." Estelle said, "He told me in one of his letters while he was still in Kansas that you had told him you were plain and said it like a warning." Florence said, "I did," Estelle said. "He told me he had written back that he had not ridden 200 miles for pretty." She looked at Florence. "That was the moment I knew you were the right one," Florence said. "Because of what he wrote," Estelle said. "Because of what made him write it. He was not thinking about your looks, Florence. He was thinking about you." A woman had told him something true about herself with complete honesty and no self-pity, and his response was to think, "That is the woman I want to know. That is my son." She said it with a pride that was quiet and absolute. Florence looked at the moon over the Texas plain and felt the familiar loosening in her chest that had been happening for over a year now in various moments, and which she was coming to understand was not weakness but the opposite, the feeling of a wall coming down that had never needed to be as high as she had built it. She said, "He is a good man," Estelle said. "He is a very good man," Florence said. "I know it more every day." Estelle left the next morning, and Florence stood at the gate and watched the coach until it was a small shape on the horizon and then gone, and she stood there another moment after that. Nelson came to stand beside her. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." "I am very all right," he said. "She likes you enormously." Florence said, "I know I like her enormously," he said. "I thought you would." He put his arm around her shoulders in the uncomplicated way he had developed of being affectionate without making it a production, and she leaned into him very slightly, which was considerable, and they stood at the gate for a moment looking at the Texas morning. He said, "She won't come again. She's not well enough for the journey." Florence said, "I know." "We will go to Missouri," he said. "Yes," she said, "in the spring when William is old enough." He said, "Yes," she said, "I want her to know him." He said quietly, "I know you do. Thank you for that." The autumn of 1883 was a good one on the longbow. The cattle were well. The calving projections for the coming spring were excellent. Cal had married a woman from the nearby settlement, a practical and good-natured woman named Bess, who was immediately welcomed by Florence with a directness that Bess found somewhat startling and then refreshing. Roy was talking about saving enough to start his own small operation within a few years, and Nelson had told him that, when the time came, he would help where he could, which was the kind of thing Nelson Carver did without announcement. Florence had in this time become entirely herself in this new landscape. She knew the land now with the intimacy of a person who has studied something until it is part of them. She knew which sections of the range were best in which seasons. She knew the signs of the particular weather patterns of the Panhandle. She knew the cattle individually, which made Cal shake his head with respect he expressed through comments like, "She knows that brindles temper better than I do," said to nobody in particular, but meaning it as sincere admiration. She had also, quietly and without telling anyone she was doing it, been expanding the kitchen garden beyond what it had been when she arrived. She had written away for seed varieties she had used in Kansas and combined them with what grew well in this different climate. And by the fall of 1883, the kitchen garden behind the ranch house was a serious and well-organized enterprise that produced more than the household needed, which meant Florence had begun selling the surplus to the small settlement nearby, which meant there was a modest additional income that went into the accounts they kept together. Nelson found out about the surplus sales when he saw the entry in the accounts. He said, "When did this start?" Florence said. "July," he said. "You didn't tell me," she said. "I wanted to see if it was worth telling first." He looked at the column. He said, "That's not nothing," she said. "No, it's not," he said. "Florence," she said. "What?" he said. "You are extraordinary." She looked at him. She said, "I am very ordinary. I am just paying attention." He said, "That is what is extraordinary." She looked back at the accounts and said, "The feed calculation is off again." And he said, "I did that on purpose." And she said, "I know you didn't." And he laughed, and she did too. and it was the particular ease of people who have found their footing together and know it. They went to Missouri in April of 1884, when William James was 11 months old and robust enough for travel. They took the wagon to the rail and the train to Missouri, and it was a long journey that William James found entirely agreeable because he was a child who found almost everything agreeable, which was a temperament his parents had not expected and were grateful for. Estelle Carver was smaller than she had been when she came to Texas, and Florence saw it immediately with the assessing eye she could not turn off, and understood that the journey in the fall had likely cost her more than she had let on, and she resolved to make this visit the fullest it could be for that reason. She was a good hostess in Estelle's house, which meant she helped without taking over, and she talked with Estelle at length in the afternoons, while William James slept, and Nelson visited with neighbors he had not seen in years. And she told Estelle things she had not fully told anyone, things about her mother's death and her father's quiet grief, and the years of managing alone, and the way the loneliness had become so ordinary that she had stopped recognizing it as loneliness and started calling it independence. And Estelle listened with the kind of attention that Florence recognized as familial because it was the same attention Nelson gave. Estelle said, "Are you happy?" Florence said, "Yes, I am truly happy." Estelle said, "Tell me what it feels like." Florence thought about it. She said, "It feels like not having to hold myself up by myself anymore. Not because he holds me up, but because we are both holding and neither of us is in danger of falling." She said it carefully because it was a true thing and she wanted to get it right. Estelle said, "That is exactly right." Florence said, "I did not know that was what I was missing because I had never had it." Estelle said, "Now you do." Florence said, "Now I do." Estelle died in December of 1884, peacefully, in her own house in Missouri, with neighbors present and a letter to Nelson and Florence on her writing desk that had been prepared some weeks earlier with the particular practicality of a woman who knew what was coming and wanted things in order. Florence read her portion of the letter alone and then sat with it for a while and then wrote in her journal, which she had started keeping since William was born, a description of Estelle Carver that was so complete and so specific that when Nelson asked later if he might read it, Florence said yes, and he read it twice and said, "That is her." Florence said, "I wanted to get it right." He said, "You did." He grieved his mother with the same careful brevity he brought to painful things, not undramatically but without performance, and Florence was present through it in the way she was learning to be present, not by filling the silence but by being in it with him, which was sometimes the most useful thing and sometimes the only thing. Spring came again to the Texas Panhandle in 1885 with its customary sudden enthusiasm. William James was walking now with the confident unsteadiness of a 2-year-old, who has recently discovered that legs are excellent and does not yet know their limits. He had his father's angular face and his mother's dark, watchful eyes, and he was interested in everything with an intensity that Florence recognized as her own, applied to a scale appropriate to a person of his size and age. Florence was expecting again. She told Nelson in February in the morning at the table over coffee in the same direct manner she had used before, and he received it in the same way, which was with the careful and private expression of a man whose feelings are too large to be immediately articulate. He said, "Are you well?" She said, "I am very well." He said, "Good." She said, "That's all." He said, "I am trying to find the right words." She said, "That's all right. Take your time." He looked at her across the table in the morning light and said, "Florence, I want you to know something." She said, "Tell me." He said, "I have been thinking about this since that first letter, about what it would look like, a life I was building toward, and I want you to know that it looks like exactly this. Exactly what is at this table right now. Nothing is missing." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "Nothing is missing." He said, "Nothing." She said, "Then we are in agreement." She extended her hand across the table and he took it, and they sat like that in the morning light, while William James pulled himself along the furniture in the next room with tremendous purpose and occasional commentary, and the Texas spring came through the window with the smell of grass and open distance, And Florence Cooper, who had once told a man she was plain and said it like a warning, sat across from the man who had ridden 200 miles without caring about pretty and thought. I was wrong about what needed a warning, not about being plain, that is still true, but about what it meant, about whether it mattered to the right person, about whether the right person would come at all. She had been wrong about that part. She was glad to have been wrong. Their daughter arrived in September of 1885 on a Tuesday in the same bedroom with the east window. She was smaller than William James had been, but no less emphatic about her arrival, and she had from the first moment an expression of absolute certainty about her position in the world that made Florence say, "Well, she knows what she thinks." Nelson said, "She comes by it honestly." Florence said, "She does." He said, "What do we call her?" Florence said, "Estelle." He looked at the baby and then at Florence and said nothing for a moment, and Florence watched the private thing move through his face and waited. He said, "Yes, Estelle," Florence said. "Estelle Ann, if you agree. Ann was my mother's name." He said, "Estelle Ann Carver." He said it the way he had said William James Carver, trying the weight. He said, "Both of them remembered." Florence said, "Both of them remembered." He kissed her forehead, which was a thing he had been doing for 3 years now, and which Florence had thoroughly stopped minding, and then he held Estelle Ann Carver while his wife rested, and he looked at his daughter with the same expression of astonished gratitude with which he looked at everything that had come to him since February of 1882, when a reverend in Amarillo had told him there was a woman in Kansas he ought to write to. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full. Not without difficulty, because the ranch was a serious enterprise and the weather was not always cooperative, and the cattle market had its fluctuations, and the work was constant and physical and demanding. But the difficulty was the productive kind, the kind that is building something rather than simply enduring something, and there is a very different quality to that kind of hard work. William James grew from an emphatic toddler into a serious, curious boy who followed his parents around the ranch with the attentiveness of a person who is cataloging everything for future use. He had a gift for the cattle that Nelson recognized when the boy was 4, and was already identifying individual animals by sight and noticing things about their behavior that required knowing them well. Florence noticed it too and began very quietly teaching him the things she had taught herself: how to assess and how to observe, how to know what matters and what doesn't. Estelle Ann was from the beginning a child of strong opinions delivered without hesitation, which meant that the household contained 2 people of very direct communication styles who happened to be 3 and 6 years old, and Nelson said once to Florence while watching both children conduct an argument about something involving a stick and a particular patch of ground, "Where do you think they get that?" Florence said. "I cannot imagine." He said, "No, of course not." She looked at him. She said, "Are you implying something?" He said, "I would not dare." She said, "Good," and went back to the garden. Thomas Prout continued to work the Kansas homestead well, and Florence received letters from him twice a year with the same basic reassurance that the land was cared for, and the cattle were healthy, and the fences were holding. She wrote back with advice when it was asked for and occasionally when it was not, but Thomas was a good-natured young man, and he took it the way she intended it, as information rather than criticism. In the summer of 1887, Nelson rode out with Cal to inspect the North Range, and came back with a proposal that he had apparently been thinking about for some time. He sat down at the table where Florence was working on accounts and said, "I want to talk to you about something." She said, "Go ahead." He said, "Denton died in February. His estate has gone to a cousin in Ohio who doesn't want the remaining portion of the longbow." She said, "I knew Denton died. We went to his funeral." He said, "The cousin wants to sell. The remaining portion is about 240 acres adjoining ours." She looked up. She said, "You want to buy it?" He said, "I think we should." She said, "Can we afford it?" He said, "If we sell the Kansas property." She was quiet for a moment. He waited. He knew her well enough by now to know that she needed to think things through completely before she spoke, and he had learned the exact quality of her silences well enough to tell a thinking silence from a reluctant one. "This was a thinking silence," she said. "The Kansas property is worth more than it was when I took it. Thomas has kept it well," he said. "Yes," she said. "If we sell it to Thomas, we give him first right of purchase. Fair price, not inflated," he said. "Agreed." She said, "And we use the proceeds on the Denton parcel," he said. "That's what I was thinking," she said. "Then yes, I think we should." He said, "Just like that," she said. "What did you expect?" He said, "More deliberation," she said. "I have been deliberating since you said Denton's cousin doesn't want it. That was 40 seconds ago." She looked at him. "I'm a thorough deliberator," he said. "I know you are," she said. "Write to Thomas this week." He said, "I will," she said. "And Nelson?" He said, "Yes," she said. "It was never really about the Kansas land, the land itself." He said, "I know," she said. "It was about knowing it was there." He said, "I know that too." She said, "We have enough here that is here." He said, "Yes, we do." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and 31 letters and 200 miles and 5 years were all in the same moment together, and she thought, "Yes, this is the right thing. Here is the right place. He is the right man. All of it is right." Thomas Prout bought the Kansas homestead in October of 1887 at a price that was fair and that made Thomas visibly relieved, and that Florence considered entirely satisfactory. She received his payment confirmation and filed it and wrote him a letter that was, for Florence, nearly effusive, telling him that she was glad it was him, that she had always hoped it would end up with him, that the land deserved someone who knew it and cared for it, and he was exactly that. Thomas wrote back and said he would name his first son William, and Florence read that and sat with it for a moment and then wrote back and said, "That is a very good name." The Denton parcel was purchased and incorporated into the Carver operation by the end of 1887, bringing the total acreage to just over 640, and the cattle herd had by now grown to 71 head, which was a real ranch by any measure. Nelson hired another hand, a young man named Francisco who had come up from the South and who was skilled and reliable, and Cal and Roy were still there. Roy now with his own small adjacent stake, and a profitable arrangement with Nelson to share grazing on certain sections. The house was extended in 1888 with a second bedroom for the children, built in the spring when the weather was right for it. Nelson did most of the framing himself with Cal's help, and Florence directed the interior arrangements with the efficiency of a woman who knows exactly where things belong. And when it was done, she stood in the new room with the smell of fresh lumber around her, and looked out the new window at the Texas plain, and thought about her mother's books and her father's pocket watch and the rust-red barn door and the Kansas sky. And she held all of it gently, and did not need it to be different from what it was. She went back to the main room where Nelson was cleaning up the day's tools, and she said, "It's a good room." He said, "I thought the window placement was what you wanted." She said, "It's exactly what I wanted." He said, "Good," she said. "Nelson," he said. "Yes," she said, "I want to say something." He put down the tools and looked at her. He said, "Go ahead," she said. "I told you I was plain and said it like a warning. 6 years ago." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that I have thought about it many times since, why I said it that way, and I think I understand it better now." He said, "Tell me." She said, "I said it like a warning because I expected you to use it as a reason to go, the way people had before, not with words but with distance. I thought if I got there first it would hurt less." She paused. "You did not use it as a reason to go." He said, "No," she said. "You made it irrelevant." He said, "Not irrelevant. You are what you are, Florence. I have always known that and I have never wished it different." She said, "I know. That is what I am trying to say." She looked at him. "I am telling you that you did something no one had done before. You looked at the warning and you didn't take it. You just kept going." She paused. "I am grateful for it every day. I thought you should know that." He crossed the room and she let him come, and he put his arms around her in the easy way he had of it, without preamble, and she leaned into him with the ease that 5 years of practice had made entirely natural. and the Texas evening came through the window with its extravagant colors, and neither of them said anything for a while. He said eventually into her hair, "I'm grateful too, every day," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I would ride it again," she said. 200 miles. He said, "Every mile," she said. "You're being sentimental," he said. "I am absolutely being sentimental," she said. "It suits you occasionally." He laughed, and she felt it against her, and she thought, This is what nothing missing feels like. This is the weight of it, the specific, particular, irreplaceable weight of a life that is right." William James Carver grew up to be a rancher of considerable skill who knew his cattle the way his mother had taught him to know them, with attention and care. Estelle Ann Carver grew up to be a woman of formidable intelligence and direct speech, who could manage the accounts before she was 12 and who had, her father said when she was 9, more opinions per hour than any other human being he had ever encountered, which Florence said was not a complaint. Estelle Ann said, "It is not a complaint." Florence looked at her daughter and saw herself so clearly that it was occasionally startling and always a profound, quiet pleasure. The ranch became what they had built it to be, a real working operation that sustained itself in them and employed good people and contributed to the county and the region in the way that solid, well-run enterprises do. Florence kept the garden until she knew it the way she had once known the Kansas garden, with the intimacy of someone who has worked a piece of ground long enough to understand its personality. She kept the accounts, and she kept the cattle records, and she kept, still, the copy of Jane Eyre with the leather-bound spine that had held together all these years through 2 states and several moves. And on the evenings when the work was done and the children were in bed and the fire was going down, she sometimes read it again, not because she needed to, but because it was an old companion, and Florence Cooper Carver was a woman who valued good things that had lasted. She looked up one evening from the book and found Nelson looking at her from across the room, his ledger open in his lap, looking at her with the expression she had come to know as his settled, complete, private happiness, the one he didn't know he made when he thought she wasn't noticing. She said, "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "You're looking at me." He said, "I am." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I like to." She looked at him. She said, "You are incorrigible." He said, "You knew that." She said, "Since the 3rd letter." He said, "Since the 3rd letter." She went back to her book. He went back to his ledger. The fire was warm and the night was quiet outside, and Estelle Ann had some months ago painted the front door a deep red, chosen entirely on her own initiative and executed with tremendous seriousness. And it was visible from the road in the morning light, the way the rust-red barn door in Kansas had once been visible. And Florence thought sometimes that some things carry forward in ways you do not expect them to, in colors and in doors and in the stubborn, clear-eyed persistence of the women who propped them open. The Texas sky in the mornings still did what Nelson had promised it would do. The light came through the east window of the bedroom and made everything gold, and Florence had watched it for 9 years and had not gotten tired of it, and she did not expect she would. She was not a woman who had ever wanted what she did not have. She had wanted only what was real, and she had been willing to say so, plainly, like a warning, to anyone who came looking. The warning had not worked on Nelson Carver. He had heard it and dismissed it not because he was foolish or inattentive, but because he had understood what it actually was. Not a warning about Florence, but a test of him, an unconscious one. A question asked without knowing it was being asked, which was, "Will you see me for what I am and stay anyway?" He had stayed. He had stayed, and he had built beside her, and he had looked at her with those steady, clear eyes for 9 years in the particular way of a man who has found the thing he was looking for and does not need to look away. Florence Cooper had told him she was plain and said it like a warning. Nelson Carver had said he had not ridden 200 miles for pretty. And he had been right about what mattered, and she had been right about what was true, and the two things together had made something neither of them could have made alone, which was a life, real and solid, and full of the particular beauty of things that are built carefully by people who are paying attention. The morning came through the east window. The red door faced the road. William James would be up soon, and Estelle Ann would be behind him with her opinions. Nelson would come in from the early check on the cattle and sit down at the table, and she would pour the coffee, and they would sit across from each other in the kitchen that was hers and his together, and they would begin another day of building the thing they were building, which was not finished, and which was not supposed to be finished, which was supposed to be exactly what it was, ongoing and real and theirs. Florence Cooper put her book down on the table and looked at the morning light on the wall of the kitchen and breathed the Texas air that smelled of grass and distance and the particular good smell of a house that is lived in by people who are glad to be in it. She was not plain. She was not pretty. She was Florence, which was specific and irreplaceable and exactly enough. She was home.